cold winds tore through the night, rattling the shutters of a lonely farmhouse at the edge of Stillwater, Idaho. Inside, a single lamp glowed faintly. An elderly widow, childless and drowning in debt, frail and weary from years of solitude, stood at her window, clutching a worn blanket, listening to the blizzard howl outside. It had been 12 years since her husband passed, leaving her to shoulder a house too big, a silence too heavy, and a life that seemed to shrink with each passing winter. And yet, on this night, the sound that reached her wasn't the cry of the wind. It was the desperate roar of motorcycle engines struggling against the cold. Siftenmen, ledervest soaked, faces frozen, stood shivering at Hargata. She hesitated. Who were they? What if danger followed them in? But in the end, kindness outweighed fear. She opened her door. Even with so little left to give, she couldn't turn them away. She never knew that by dawn, her forgotten farmhouse would stand at the center of a roar unlike anything her quiet town had ever heard. Before we dive deeper, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The night was bitter, the kind of cold that sank deep into bones and made every breath feel like swallowing glass. Inside the farmhouse, an elderly widow named Rose Callahan sat hunched by a kerosene lamp, her blanket drawn tight against her shoulders. The house was silent. Too silent. 12 years had passed since her husband Daniel died, and the rooms that once rang with his laughter had long since fallen quiet. There were no children to return home, no voices to ease the stillness. Just her, a pile of unpaid bills on the kitchen table, and the gnawing fear that the bank might one day take what little she had left. Rose had never imagined her life would narrow to this. A woman alone, drowning in debt, the world forgetting her existence one season at a time. She'd worked her entire life, raised livestock with Daniel, tended a garden that once fed half the county, volunteered at the church, been the kind of neighbor people could count on. But after Daniel's heart gave out, everything changed. Medical bills piled up. The farm equipment broke down. Livestock had to be sold. And slowly, quietly, Rose became invisible. Neighbors drove past without stopping. The phone stopped ringing. Even the church ladies, who'd once brought casseroles and company, found reasons to stay away. Loneliness, Rose had learned, was contagious. People feared catching it. Outside, a storm was gathering. The first flakes of snow drifted lazily, but the air carried the sharp edge of something relentless. The wind clawed at the shutters. The old house groaned, as if straining under the weight of winter's breath. Rose pulled her blanket tighter and stared at the photograph on the mantel. Daniel in his army uniform, young and proud, before war and life had aged him. "I miss you," she whispered to the empty room. The storm answered with a howl that made the windows rattle. At first, Rose thought the sound was thunder, a rolling growl beneath the storm. But it didn't fade. It grew louder, stronger, as though the ground itself was trembling. She moved to the window, heart pounding faster than she liked to admit. Through the blur of snow and darkness, faint pinpricks of light appeared. Headlights cutting through the storm like fireflies in the night. One became 5. 5 became 10. Then 15. Motorcycles. The sound pressed against her walls, low and guttural, shaking the glass in its frame. Rose froze, breath catching her chest. Bikers. Here, at the farthest edge of town, in the middle of a blizzard. It made no sense. Yet there they were, 15 figures in leather, soaked to the bone, their bikes huddled together like beasts seeking shelter. The riders dismounted, boots sinking deep into snow. They stood in the glow of their headlights, steam rising from engines fighting to stay alive against the cold. These were not men out for the joy of the ride. These were travelers stranded, caught in a storm that threatened to consume them. The knock came. Slow, heavy, a fist against wood. Rose didn't move. The second knock followed, louder, insistent. Her eyes darted to the old rotary phone on the wall. Should she call the sheriff? Would anyone come through the storm in time? The knock came again. This time a voice followed. Deep, rough, yet strangely steady. "Ma'am, please. We're freezing out here." Rose's hand trembled on her blanket. Every warning she'd ever learned screamed at her to stay behind the locked door. And yet another voice rose inside her. Not from the storm, not from the men outside. From memory, Daniel's voice, clear as if he were standing beside her, always helped the traveler Rose. Even if he looks like an enemy, the road changes a man. Sometimes all he needs is a place to rest. She swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing against her fear. Slowly, she rose from her chair. Her knees ached as she crossed the wooden floor, each step echoing too loudly in the silence. At the door, she paused. Her hand hovered over the latch. The storm howled outside. Desperation clung to the air. She closed her eyes, saw Daniel smile, felt the strength of his hand in hers. With a breath as fragile as it was brave, Rose turned the latch and pulled open the door. Snow and wind rushed inside, swirling around her blanket. Beyond the threshold stood a figure, tall, broad, his leather vest soaked, his beard frozen with shards of ice. He removed his helmet, revealing tired eyes that, despite their roughness, carried something human. "Please, ma'am," he said quietly. "We don't mean trouble, just warmth." Behind him, 14 others stood shivering, breath rising in clouds, bodies heavy with fatigue. Rose looked at them, really looked at them, past the leather and tattoos, past the reputation society had given them. She saw exhaustion, desperation, men who'd run out of options. "Come in," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "before you freeze to death." The bikers filed inside one by one, bringing with them the bite of winter and the smell of wet leather. The leader was the last to enter. He turned to Rose, snow melting in his beard. "Name's Cole Hayes," he said. "We're the Iron Riders MC. We got separated from our convoy in the storm. Been riding for hours looking for shelter." Rose nodded. "I'm Rose. Rose Callahan." She moved to the kitchen, her hands remembering what to do even as her mind raced. Soup. She had soup, thin vegetable broth she'd made to stretch through the week. Bread she'd baked yesterday. Coffee that was mostly grounds and determination. It wasn't much, but it was something. The bikers crowded into her small living room, their presence overwhelming the space. They were giants in a dollhouse, all sharp edges and hard angles. But as Rose brought out bowls and mugs, something shifted. "Thank you, ma'am," one said, his voice rough with cold and gratitude. "God bless you," another murmured. They ate slowly, savoring the warmth more than the taste. And as the fire crackled and the storm raged outside, the tension began to ease. One of the younger riders started coughing, harsh, rattling coughs that shook his whole body. Rose was beside him in an instant. "Let me see," she said, her voice taking on a tone of command that surprised even her. Her hands, weathered and worn, moved with practiced efficiency. She'd been a medic in her youth before she married Daniel. Had worked in field hospitals, had held dying soldiers, had learned to read symptoms in the dark. She pressed her palm to the young man's forehead. Felt the fever there. "Pneumonia," she said quietly. "Early stages. You need rest and warmth, or this'll kill you before the storm does." The bikers exchanged glances. They'd thought her helpless, fragile. They were wrong. Rose worked through the night, tending the sick rider, feeding the others, keeping the fire burning. She moved through her home with purpose she hadn't felt in years. And slowly, the bikers began to see her differently. Not as a victim, not as a burden, as someone stronger than any of them. Dawn broke cold and clear. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in white. Rose stood at her window, exhausted but somehow lighter. The bikers stirred behind her, preparing to leave. Cole approached, his expression serious. "Ma'am, we owe you our lives. That boy with pneumonia, he wouldn't have made it through the night without you." Rose waved him off. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Cole said firmly. "You did what most people wouldn't. You opened your door to strangers in a storm. You gave everything you had." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "This is our club's emergency fund. It's yours now." Rose tried to refuse, but Cole pressed it into her hands. "We'll be back," he promised, "to make sure you're okay." The bikers left as the sun climbed higher, their engines fading into the distance. Rose stood on her porch, watching them go, the envelope heavy in her hands. She opened it later and nearly collapsed. $3,000. Enough to pay her overdue mortgage. Enough to fix the roof. Enough to breathe again. But that wasn't the end. 2 weeks later, Rose woke to a sound that shook her awake. The rumble of engines. Not 15 this time. Hundreds. She rushed to the window, and her breath caught. 800 motorcycles lined the road leading to her farmhouse. The Iron Riders had returned, and they'd brought reinforcements. Cole stood at the front, his hand raised. The engines cut off in perfect unison. Silence. Then Cole's voice carried across the snow. Rose Callahan opened her door when we had nowhere else to go. She gave us warmth. Food. Her last resources. She saved my brother's life. He turned to face her. We don't leave debts unpaid. What happened next would become legend in Stillwater, Idaho. Trucks appeared, loaded with lumber, shingles, paint, tools. The bikers swarmed her property, not as invaders, but as builders. They repaired her roof, fixed her fence, painted her house, stocked her pantry, cleared her debts. Neighbors who'd ignored her for years stood watching in stunned silence as 800 bikers transformed Rose's crumbling farmhouse into something beautiful again. By sunset, the work was done. Cole approached Rose one final time, holding a leather vest. On the back, embroidered in careful stitching, Iron Riders MC. Honorary member, Rose Guardian Callahan. Your family now? Cole said simply. Rose's eyes filled with tears. Why? Why do all this? Because 12 years ago, Cole said quietly, you and your husband sheltered a biker during a storm. You didn't know it, but that biker was my father. He never forgot your kindness. And when he died last year, he made me promise something. He met her eyes. If I ever rode through Stillwater, I was to check on the woman who saved his life. Make sure she was okay. Rose's hand flew to her mouth. I remember. Daniel and we helped a man, but he left before morning. He carried your kindness with him for 20 years, Cole said. And last night, you saved my brother. This is how the Iron Riders honor our debts. The engines roared to life again, and 800 riders gave her a final salute before disappearing down the road. Rose stood on her newly repaired porch, the vest draped over her shoulders, and for the first time in 12 years, she didn't feel alone. That night, Rose sat by her window. The leather vest hung on the back of Daniel's old chair. She touched the photograph on the mantel. Daniel in his uniform, forever young. You were right, she whispered. Always help the traveler. Outside, the night was quiet, but in her heart, Rose could still hear them. The low, steady hum of 800 engines, a song of brotherhood and honor that would echo forever. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness ripples outward until it shakes the very ground beneath us. Rose Callahan had opened her door to 15 freezing strangers, and 800 came back to make sure she'd never be forgotten again. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button right now. Share it with someone who needs to remember that kindness is never wasted, that small acts can change everything, and that sometimes the people society fears most are the ones who understand honor best. Drop a comment saying, I'd open the door if you'd choose kindness over fear. Because Rose was alone, broke, and forgotten when those bikers knocked on her door in the middle of a blizzard. She had every reason to turn them away. She didn't. And that choice, that single moment of compassion, changed everything. Not just for 15 men who would have frozen to death, but for Rose herself, who learned that family isn't always blood. Sometimes family is 800 bikers who refuse to let you face the world alone. Be the Rose in someone's story.